name is Sean-Patric. I'm a junior music education major, and I believe that everything we do is music. The purpose of this research was to examine the compositional techniques of John Cage and the avant-garde style that he helped pioneer through the early 20th century. I had 4 problems while doing this. The first, to examine the life of John Cage. The second, to define what avant-garde is and how John Cage affected it. The third, to identify avant-garde techniques used in sonatas and interludes for prepared piano, number 3. And the fourth, to compose an avant-garde piece that I named Aaliyah. These are my top sources. The first one is John Cage's own personal autobiography, which helped give a lot of insight into what he saw and how he interpreted music. The next was a book entitled Listen to This, where it's a series of articles detailing the evolution of 20th century music. And the final was Jim Sampson's definition of avant-garde, which really helped shape the way I saw things as they needed to be. My first problem was examining the life of John Cage. He was born September 5th, 1912. His father was an inventor, and his mother was a journalist. And his father, as he was growing up, would tell him, "Son, if something's not broken, but you can still rework it, do it. Somebody will buy it." And that kind of gave John Cage the kick that he needed to do things. So he dropped out of college in the early 20s after being disgusted by his own competitions, believing they were the worst he could possibly accomplish. He went and for 2 years worked with Arnold Schoenberg in 1931, and he studied with him until Schoenberg looked at him and said, "You have no feeling for harmony," which, if you're a musician, is an awful thing to hear. You would think, well, just go do English. But John Cage took the criticism in stride and began to compose. Defining avant-garde. Jim Sampson defines that as any artist who has made a radical departure from tradition. When I typed this definition out, John Cage was obviously the one I had in mind, but later through music history, Igor Stravinsky and The Rite of Spring came up. The man composed a piece that caused riots the night it was premiered. That is a radical departure from tradition. John Cage composed what was called aleatoric music, which is music that cannot be predicted before composition or performance. So he has a piece called Water Walks that I'll discuss later, where he pours water. And sometimes it'll make a noise and sometimes it won't. It's unknown how it's going to sound before you play it. To really help elaborate on this, John Cage composed using the Chinese book of changes called the I Ching, where he would take a series of coins, ask a question, flip the coins, and find how they landed in the book, and it would give him a vague response, such as, "Should this next measure contain a rest? The clouds move in your favor." All right, rest it is. And that's kind of how he composed it. He went through and asked vague questions and got vague answers. John Cage's biggest avant-garde movement, though, was his use of silence. What you're looking at is the score for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Pass it, pass it, pass it. The piano player will sit at the piano, take a stopwatch, and go. For 4 minutes and 33 seconds. The piece is meant to make you uncomfortable. It's meant to show people what sounds are and how we form music ourselves. Water Walks, that I've discussed earlier, was along the same lines. It makes people uncomfortable. It's not just the bubbles or the water running over things or dripping off. It's the people shuffling their programs or whispering and trying to figure out what's actually going on, or is this guy serious? My personal favorite is 433 number 2, also known as 000. The first performance of which John Cage stepped up to the podium, looked at his orchestra, bent over, pulled out a pencil, and wrote, "In a well-amplified space, in front of an audience, perform a dignified action." He stepped off stage, he bowed, and he walked off stage. And that was the very first performance of that piece. Alex Ross, in his book Listen to This, told of how he went to a place a little bit outside of Woodstock to hear this piano performance. The concert hall he went to, he said, was no bigger than a barn, really, and it was a warm spring night, so they left the door open, so when he saw 433, he thought this was going to be interesting. That night, 433 sounded like birds and bugs and DMX and all sorts of other things that he heard as cars drove by or birds tweeted or anything. Hello, Lynchburg College signal. Problem 3 was to identify avant-garde techniques used in sonatas and interludes number 3. Now, this giant quote is explaining what this picture is. The preparation of this piano is quite elaborate, and it takes 2 to 3 hours to complete. A total of 45 notes are prepared, mainly with screws and bolts, but also with 15 pieces of rubber, 4 pieces of plastic, 6 nuts, and 1 eraser. In more recent years, there's been a tendency to perform this work on smaller concert pianos as opposed to large grand pianos, because that's along the same lines of what John Cage would have written this on. What the left picture is it gives a note value, or it gives the note. It gives what should be there, how many of them there should be, and the distance up the string it should be. So one might say, well, let's take a C, let's take a rubber eraser, just one, and we're going to put it a quarter of the way up the string. So we find it, shove it in there. And he literally just shoved them in between the strings, and it gave it an interesting sound. So let's take a quick listen at what that sounds like. That had nuts, bolts, erasers, screws, and everything you can think of shoved into those strings. And that's what it sounds like. And that's what many of these pieces sound like. So, let's talk about some compositional techniques for it. Well, for one, it's a prepared piano. It's written in a lot of different meters and time signatures, which isn't that different from things we listen to now. But when you're trying to play something that sounds like this, it gets a little difficult. And in many places, he has 16 VA written. Now, for piano players, that's 8 VAs in normal notation. It means to take your hands either 1 octave higher or 1 octave lower. 16 VA, by process of elimination, would mean 2 octaves. But the proper notation is actually 15 because of the way that intervals line up and everything. So it's improperly notated. There are places on the score where he simply wrote loco in the middle of it. It's not easy to read for piano players, while simultaneously looking like piano music. My fourth problem, if these guys will step up and start getting warmed up, was to compose an avant-garde piece that I called Alia, which comes from the name aleatoric music, which means dice music. Why did I call it dice? Because I composed it using dice. I had 3 separate die, one 12-sided die that gave me 1 note in a 1 octave chromatic scale, one 4-sided die that gave me a note value, either an 1/8 note, a quarter note, a half note, or a whole note, and one 4-sided die that gave me the volume of either piano, mezzo forte, or forte. And I rolled them, and it gave me, the first time, this piece, which was originally for alto saxophone. But I decided for this to expand it into kind of an SATB arrangement, which is soprano, alto, tenor, bass, for flute, clarinet, tenor sax, and trombone. So, let Mr. Zach get into place, and then we'll run this thing. My warning to you is that this will not sound good. This will not be pleasing to your ear. This will sound confusing and like a mess. That is not the fault of my players, and I apologize for them. You guys ready? I'm going to count up. 1, 2, ready, play. So, what does this mean? Implications for music education. It's an important genre of music to hear how things changed in the 20th century, especially with things like Rite of Spring or 433. I had this idea while I was writing this out that it would be an interesting class experiment to give students die and have them compose their own Aliyah. And I think that would just be an incredible thing to watch as students started to understand that music is everything. It's okay if it doesn't sound pretty. It's okay if it doesn't sound in time together. This is my bibliography. Special thanks to Rachel Stidham, Jacob Elder, Zachary Spalding, and K.O. Lott for actually playing that mess. Louis Donato for the idea to put them on shirts. Dr. Cynthia Ramsey, Dr. Rita Hatcher, Mandy Boggs for staying up late with me and putting shirts together. Are there any questions? Yes, Dr. Ramsey.
I'm assuming KO's part was the one with the dice?
All of them.
So you rolled dice differently for each one of the people, and
Yes,
then
ma'am.
put it down for the 4 people to play.
Yes, ma'am.
It was not noise. That was great. I guess
Thank
I've
you, ma'am.
listened to too much 20th century music, and that's the first time I've heard it. So this was that was good.
Well, I'm glad you liked it. You're the important one.
Don't call it noise and a mess. That's good.